Everybody has tropes and storytelling devices that they absolutely adore, and ones that they absolutely abhor. And today I'm talking about the ones that I dislike, and ones that are quite popular in modern storytelling. I'm focusing here not just on novels, but also on films and media generally, anything to do with modern storytelling that I just find doesn't work, and I hope that we can get over either now or in the next few years. One caveat is that I'm not saying that these things are intrinsically bad, although in some cases I will give arguments for why I think that generally people should avoid them, but I'm just saying that they often are bad, or that they use too much, and those are my criticisms, not that this is not a way to tell a story at all. With that out of the way, let's jump into the first one, which is probably the one on this list that I hate the most, maybe the second most, and that is the redemption arc. The redemption arc, as the name suggests, is where you take usually a previously established villain. It can happen within a single novel, standalone, or film, but generally it's a villain that already exists from previous stories, and you take them and you redeem them in some way. Typically this is done by giving them a tragic backstory where you realise that the reason why they're such a bad person is because their parents were so mean to them and they were bullied at school and it's just so hard being evil. Or you get something where they are redeemed by something that they do in the course of a particular story. So something happens to them and they see the error of their ways. I prefer that second kind of redemption arc, but typically it's the first one that gets used, especially in things like the Disney films. That's a really good example of this. An example of the other version would be something like Jaime Lannister's character from A Song of Ice and Fire, where you have someone who is initially morally repugnant, going through changes, and I would say that that's maybe a more positive example of a redemption arc. And the reason for that is that Jaime's character, he actually goes through believable changes. He realizes that he's a bit of a dupe when it comes to his sister. He realizes that his sister is also kind of insane and sometimes does use him. And he just comes into contact with characters who do have morals, and he has to confront his own constantly throughout the story. So he works really well as a character. Also, the main evil thing that he's known for at the very beginning of the story is killing the Mad King, which is already a morally complicated decision anyway. So that's an example of a redemption arc that I think works really well. Obviously, they kind of ruined that with the TV show. Who knows how it'll go in the books? But that's an example of something that I think that works. But typically, though, the reason why I dislike this trope is because I think it actually ruins villains and the reasons why we like villains. The reason why we like villains is often because they're incredibly charismatic, charming, funny, whereas the heroes tend to be a little bit more dour and serious. And the reason I think for this, at least in a storytelling perspective, is that if you didn't offset a villain with some kind of charm, then it would be quite hard to really engage with the story at all. The best villains are the ones that charm us, the ones that maybe even have a point sometimes, it's just that they go too far with it. Those are the ones that really work. But the problem is, when you want to make them into a hero, or you want to redeem them, it often takes the bite away from them. It takes away the thing that made them special. Either because they become a boring goody two-shoes who just spends all their time guilty over their wrongs, in which case it's kind of dull, or you undermine their own backstory. And for me, this is where the idea of giving someone a tragic backstory really falls flat. It falls flat for several reasons. One, the idea that in order for someone to become a villain, they have to have had something happen to them in the past that was traumatic is just a crock as far as I'm concerned. There are plenty of people who go through similar upbringings with that much pain and more who don't turn out to be evil people. And equally, there are people who go through, completely happy, contented lives from the outside. Their parents love them, they go on holidays, they have all the money, whatever, and they still turn out to be evil or murderers or whatever. So this is just lazy storytelling as far as I'm concerned. It can be done well, it's just often done as a lazy way to make you feel sympathy for someone who, after all, is a villain. And this is another reason why I don't like the redemption arc, because it's sort of a way to manipulate the reader or viewer into forgetting the villainy that's actually been committed. For me, a really good example of a redemption arc that works, that doesn't let the villain get away with it, would be something like Heathcliff in Wuthering Heights. He is redeemed in the course of the story, but at the cost of it is his death. And really that death was sort of the only way it could go, because in reality, he did some terrible things, and you don't just get forgiven and forget just because you become a bit nicey nice towards the end. You still did terrible things. And I think that that is something that bugs me about the redemption arc. It excuses villainy and just asks the reader or viewer to just sort of look over the terrible things that they did because they're good now. And so I find that very annoying. My main issue, though, is that I think we should just let villains be villains. As far as I'm concerned, villains should be like rockets fireworks. They come into a story, they inject it with the life, the tension, and at the end they're defeated, it all goes out, or maybe they win, but if they're defeated, they go with a bang, and that's them done. Don't bring them back, because when you bring them back, which is another issue that I'm not going to get into, but when they come back, it takes away the threat, because they just keep losing, so it's not very threatening. And it just takes away what they are good at. They are good at just being this big firework that causes the tension and then leaves. Let the heroes be the ones that stick around. The next trope I want to talk about is related, I think, to redemption arcs, but not quite. This one is the anti-hero. So rather than having a villain who is redeemed through some nonsense backstory, we have instead someone who is morally corrupt in some ways. Anti-heroes can be more or less severe, so it could be that they're a serial killer, but they're sort of have a moral code or something like that, or they're a thug, but they also have some kind of moral code of ethics as well, or they could be maybe slightly less insanely flawed, but they're still an anti-hero because they don't fit that mold of virtue that the hero typically does. Now, the anti-hero is an excellent trope. I just think it's really had its day, which is my first objection to it. There are anti-heroes everywhere. They're dark, they're brooding, and they're very annoying. And I think we've just had too much of it. I think we need to go back to some good old-fashioned heroes. I think in our time, heroes that are actually just virtuous would probably be better to relate to than these sort of anti-hero types who are just really terrible people. So I think that's the first thing that I want to say is just, I think the trope's overdone at this point. It's like vampires. I quite like vampires. I think they're a great horror creature. Nevertheless, we've sort of done them to death, and I think it's going to take a long time before they can actually make a comeback that's not just embarrassing. Likewise with the anti-hero. The second reason why I don't like it is that sometimes I just get the impression that the reason why people have an anti-hero is because they just want to write a character that does shocking things and to sort of get away with it by glossing over these facts. The fact is, a lot of anti-heroes are pretty unlikable, they're pretty wretched, and it can only really work, I think, as a trope if they still face consequences for their actions. And again, I'm going to use Heathcliff here, because I think he is just the perfect example of an anti-hero that works. Heathcliff is pretty much rotten to the core by the end of the story, and although he does have a moment of realization, and he wants to be forgiven and things by the end, he's still gone too far by that point, and he still has to face the consequences of his actions, which he does in a sort of poetic Emily Bronte way, by dying for them. And I think that is how an anti-hero should work, because ultimately they are typically grounded in some kind of vice, and that should have consequences and ramifications on them. And if it doesn't, if the only ramification of the hero's evil deeds in the past are just that he or she broods every flipping 5 minutes, then I'm just not interested, really. I want to see actual consequences from those past deeds. I want to see that it really does affect them. I want to see that the moral code they have is genuine and not just some speech that they give with some rousing music if it's a film, or just a speech if it's a book, that's supposed to make the reader go, oh yes, they are a good person after all. That for me is really important. An argument that people give for anti-heroes, which I think is a bit bizarre, is something like, well, I can't relate to, say, Superman because he's too perfect and wonderful. I need an anti-hero because I do bad things too. And now I do sort of agree with this, if it's a Mary Sue kind of hero, which Superman isn't, then I can see why you would think that they're too pristine. But most decent heroes aren't like that. Most of the big heroes in many books, Harry Potter is a good example of this, he's not perfect. He's got anger issues, he takes it out on his friends, he makes terrible decisions. Think of most of the heroes from Game of Thrones who are on the more good side. Even they make mistakes. So this idea that the only way that you can relate to a character, a protagonist, is if they have some villainy going on in the background, it makes those people sound suspect, Can you only relate to someone if they've committed a murder? Did you commit a murder? So it's just an odd argument. I think it's an argument against Mary Sue's and the male equivalent, but it's not, to me, it's not a good argument against, typical virtuous or mostly virtuous heroes who do have some flaws and overcome them. So for me, I just think the anti-hero trope, it's overdone, it's often done badly, and the idea that we need those kind of characters to relate to, I just think is a very bizarre argument, and says maybe more about the people who make that argument than it does about the device as a good use for storytelling. This one is less of a trope and more of a storytelling device, a way of framing stories, telling stories, and that is sarcasm and irony. And I'm going to start here by actually talking not about storytelling, but about music. So I was in an album club for a long time with some friends, and every week we would get together online and we would listen to an album and then we talk about it. Now, for me, my music tastes, I like music and I like lyrics. I think that they should go together well. I think they should complement each other. I think that you can't just write amazing lyrics and then have crappy music on and say, oh yeah, but it's just about the lyrics. It's like, yeah, but you're choosing to set them to music, so set them to good music, please. And likewise with lyrics, if you're going to go through the effort of writing them, you can't just say, oh, it's all about the music. Well, just don't say anything. Just make noises. I don't want to listen to cringy lyrics if you can't write them. So for me, it's a matter of things coming together, and both of them need to be good. Now, one thing that would happen with a couple of albums, maybe quite a few actually, was that I would complain about lyrics. And sometimes friends would say something like, oh yes, but these lyrics are meant to be ironic. They're sort of taking the piss out of this sort of style, or they're being ironic, they're above it all, blah, 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 blah. And fair enough, sometimes people are being genuinely ironic, but I found myself becoming irritated with that response. And then when I also saw it in the case of films and in books, I started to become annoyed with it there as well. And the reason for this is that oftentimes you have something that's just bad, whether it's a bad story, a bad narrative, a rubbish character, a rubbish plot contrivance, and then the creator of this absolute pile of garbage will just say something like, oh yeah, but I was being ironic. I was, pastiching this thing. So it's not that it's bad, it's that it's meant to be bad. And you're stupid because you don't get the irony, darling. And to that I say, well, you can still be intelligent and ironic. You don't have to be trivial. So even if the irony thing works, you've still been ironic in a trivial way. So that is just a non-starter for me anyway. But the thing that I find is that irony is just used as a way, like I say, for writers to make excuses for bad writing. I think that is genuinely sometimes what people will do. Another reason why I dislike it is that it always seems to come across, when an author is being ironic, to come across as sort of condescending to the things that are going on, or the thing that's been parodied or whatever, or even to the reader. There's always this sort of air of superiority with people that are being ironic that's always rubbed me off the wrong way. And so that really bugs me. The third thing is that I think it always creates a kind of distance between yourself and the novel. An example historically would be Jane Austen. She uses so much irony that a lot of people feel like they can't fully connect with her world sometimes. Now, I do actually find that I can connect, because although her novels are steeped in irony, she's also very sincere, and characters do have sincere moments where they break through the comedy of manners to say something deep and insightful. Anyone that thinks otherwise should definitely give Persuasion a read, which makes that really apparent as far as I can see. Pride and Prejudice and Emma are a little bit more ironic, and it's harder to get to it there. But something like Persuasion, I think, is a good example of how to do irony well. To have that distance, to make those comments without sounding condescending, but then also to have sincerity and substance at the heart of it. But most of the time, I find that it just distances myself from the novel. I find it very hard to connect to a novel or a song or a film if it's all just ironic posturing, because it puts you above whatever it is that the thing's about. And for me, that's not what I enjoy about storytelling. I want to get lost in the world. I don't want to be reminded that this is just a story, bro. I hate that kind of thing. I find it very annoying. And like I say, oftentimes just covering up for bad aesthetic choices. I think this is one of the reasons why I really enjoy older novels, and in particular sort of 1800s Victorian literature, because I find that there is a sincerity in those big novels that you just don't get very often, or at least not as much in modern things. People are afraid to be sincere because it's exposing, right? If you're being really sincere about what you've written, then that means that you really meant it. So if the metaphor is bad, it's on you because you're a bad writer. But if you have the ironic excuse, you can hide behind it, because now it's not you that is the bad writer, it's the thing that you're parodying that is bad. Now this is, like I said, it's just a false thing to say, because you can be ironic in a clever way, read Jane Austen, or you can be, ironic in a dumb way. So I think that argument doesn't really work. But still, it is a very convenient excuse, and I do see people use it. So if there's one thing on this list I really want to get rid of, it's the irony, it's the sarcasm, it's the satire, and it's using these things as crutches when actually the writing's just poor. Next up, we have the trope of shock deaths. This has definitely been popularized by A Song of Ice and Fire, but interestingly, this is an example of a book that actually does a shock death. In some ways the best, but in other ways not so much the best. It's kind of got the best and the worst of the shock death in it, so this is an interesting example. But shock death, it's kind of obvious from the name. It's when you have a character who you build up as, the central protagonist, and then you just kill them out of the blue, and it's a complete, didn't see it coming at all. It's a great moment. It's like a jump scare in a horror movie, but like a jump scare in a horror movie, once it's happened once, it's not happening again. So if all you have in your horror movie is jump scares, it's not really worth repeat watches. And likewise, if all you have in your novel is shock tactics and shock deaths, it does diminish the quality of your novel. However, it can be done very well, and A Song of Ice and Fire is an example where it does. So obviously the deaths I'm talking about here are the deaths that occur in the Red Wedding, and the story really does do a good job of completely bringing that out of left field. But when you read the novels again, or when you watch the show, whichever is your preference, you can see that the seeds of this were sown pretty much from the start of the story. It's a slow build-up that you can, when you read it again, you can see coming, and so you can really appreciate the masterful storytelling of that, because this is something that the author has thought about. They've planted those seeds, they developed that whole thing, but in very subtle ways that you don't see when you're going through the first time, so it feels like a complete shock, but actually it's not. And that is a really good example of an excellent way to do it. Now, one of the problems with this, of course, and this I think Song of Ice and Fire does struggle with, is that by eliminating characters, it does also give you a cost, which is that if you can't replace those characters with equivalently good ones, then your story suffers. And for me, I do feel like, in both the show and the books, once the Starks are basically eradicated, my interest in the story did diminish a bit. I did find that a lot of the replacement characters didn't quite live up to the original ones, and so I do think that there is an issue with this kind of storytelling. I think that what you want to do is you either want to do the shock death early enough into the novel that people haven't, or the series, so early enough that people haven't fully invested in those characters, but they've invested enough that they like them. I think that's why Ned Stark's death works quite well, because he's the main protagonist of the first novel, but then he's gone. And then you've got so much other stuff going on that while his death is sad, there are other characters doing the heavy lifting that were also with him from the beginning. So that works quite well. Or you do it towards the end. Not right at the end, because it's the end of the novel, so people can expect a death, but at the point that's sort of, just past the midway. And an example, surprisingly, that I think does this really well is R.F. Kuang in Babel. As much as I didn't like that novel, there is a character in that novel that this does happen, and it happens, like I say, at a point that is not too far past the midway, and it just completely shocked me. I wasn't expecting it. It wasn't built up in that way for that to happen. It just did, and that was a very effective use of that, because there's still enough of the other cast to pick up the story after that, so you don't have the risk of, a character vacuum, but so it worked really well. And so I think that that's what you have to do. You have to time when the shock death occurs. But if you've got a very long series that's going to go on for several books after they've died, be careful which characters you choose to kill. In any case, shock deaths are all well and good, but I think sometimes, and maybe The Walking Dead, the TV show, zombies, not that I watch that much of it, it's more I just know it by reputation, is an example of something where I think the shock deaths are just done maybe more for the sake of just shocking people. And I just find that to be annoying. It often leads to very unsatisfying character conclusions, where characters just vanish mid-storyline for no real reason. It just comes across as a way to keep the audiences on their seats, but as I said, when you do it again and again and again, it's diminishing returns, and it does just limit the rewatchability of the program or the readability of the novel. So you have to be very careful with that one. I would say of the things on this list, though, this is probably the one that I hate the least, because I think it can be well done, but I think oftentimes it really isn't. And the last one on the list is subverting expectations. Pretty obvious what this one is all about. The recipe here is you take some trope that is very popular, either historically or in the present. You create a story in which it seems like your story is going to be an instance of that trope, and then, shock, surprise, it's actually not, and you go a completely different direction. Now, this one is a trope that, like all of them, I think it can be done very well. Game of Thrones, good example of someone who does that quite well, because again, it's a matter of doing it in a clever way where you sow the seeds for subversion, rather than just doing it because you've written yourself into a corner and need to change things, rather than doing it, which I find a lot with long-standing series. Sometimes authors will do it because their readership has worked out what's going to happen in the story, and because their sort of egos are triggered by this, they then shock them by doing something else. The problem with that is it leads to very unsatisfying storytelling, because the readers see through it, they know that that's what's going on, and then the thing that you've switched to doesn't necessarily gel with what came before, so it doesn't follow the logic of the story, and so it sort of ruins it a little bit. That's not to say that people can't do this well. I think Dickens is an example of someone who does this quite well, but that's partly because Dickens often didn't have a fully fledged concrete plot along the way. He was often making decisions as he went along, and so it was much easier for him to make those flips and switches. But when you've got a meticulously plotted story, where you've planned out that this character is going in this direction from, day one, and suddenly they don't, it's much harder to do that effectively. Another reason why I dislike this one, I'm thinking here of the Star Wars films as an example. Not that I got that far with the new ones. I think I only watched the first one. So again, this is just from hearsay. But you have the creators of these things where they sort of smugly enjoy subverting people's expectations. And another good example is the Wheel of Time series, which I think is just abysmally bad as an adaptation, and also not that good on its own 2 feet as a story. I think it's atrocious. And you get this sort of delight of these people where they're like, oh look, I've shocked you. You thought this was going to happen, but this happened instead. And the problem is, it's like, why, instead of focusing on annoying people, why don't you focus on telling a good story? And if that involves shocking people, go ahead and do it. But it might not. It might actually mean going along with what the story seems to be suggesting, rather than just turning things around in order to be shocking. Like the shock death, this is one of these cheap tactics where it's really effective the first time, but afterwards, when you start to read the thing or watch the thing over again and you see how it just doesn't fit, you come to see it for what it is, which is a cheap tactic. Of course, though, this is a trope that can never truly die, precisely because it is also somewhat one of the most creative tropes, and when done well, it actually can be one of the best. An example of some clever subversion, for me, would come from Angela Carter and Her Bloody Chamber. This is a collection of fairy tales that she deliberately subverts in various ways. She emphasizes the sexual nature in the stories, she puts feminist twists on them, some people call it post-feminism, whatever you want to call it. She's subverting these classic stories, and she manages to do it in ways that are actually quite interesting and sometimes insightful. It's not just some cheap, well, I would like the story to end in this way, so subvert. It's actually quite thoughtful and gets you to think about the original stories and what might or might not be lurking between the lines. And that to me is a clever kind of subversion. It's not just changing things for the sake of it, but it's finding something in the original thing, subverting it in a way that then gets you as the reader to then reflect on the original thing in a way that is rewarding. And that for me is how it is supposed to work, but often it's just, like I say, a cheap tactic to shock people. Alright, that is it for my list of popular storytelling devices and tropes that I completely dislike, and hope that if we can at least calm down a bit with them, or in some cases just get rid of them for a while, I would be a much happier reader or just consumer of stories. Let me know down in the comments, what are your thoughts on any of these tropes or devices? What are the ones that you find really annoying that you wish would just go away? Look forward to hearing about that in the comments. Otherwise, take care everyone. Ta-ra.